welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people that I've connected with in the world of arts and entertainment over the years, most of whom are all just a little bit more famous than I am. And today I'm glad to have back with us for a return visit, rock and roll documentarian and author of the Canadian Pop Music Encyclopedia, Mr. Jaimie Vernon. Welcome back to the show, Jaimie.
Hey, Tommy. It's great to be back.
Well, it's great to have you. So, not that long ago, I posted something on Facebook about, it was an excerpt from the book that I'm trying to finish writing about my own life. And I talked about a band that I had encountered way back, and they were called Lennox. And out of that band came a couple of other bands. And without getting into all the details right now, you jumped on the post and corrected me on some details. And I thought, well, Mr. Walking Encyclopedia of Rock and Roll, let's talk about this further. So that's what we're here to do today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name a band or an act and let you go off on it with as much trivia as you can. So are you ready?
I hope so.
All right, Jaimie. So
do we have the Jeopardy music to play in the background here? Da, 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 da.
Okay, so let's start with one that I'm pretty sure you've got some info and some, well, not necessarily dirt, but cool stuff. Klaatu.
Klaatu. Oh, my buddies. Yeah, all kinds of stuff, actually, about Klaatu. For those that don't know, they wrote the song Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft, which became a hit for the Carpenters, actually. Richard Carpenter of the duo heard the song and thought it was absolutely freaking amazing. So they did a cover of it. And as it turns out, unfortunately, despite it going top 40 for them, the album that it came off of, Passengers, was the worst-selling Carpenters record of all because he'd kind of gone outside of what the Carpenters had been doing and recorded some really eclectic stuff, not just Calling Occupants, but some other songs that the fans just kind of went, what? Where's the Burt Bacharach tunes? You know what I mean? So Klaatu was lucky in that that song actually keeps getting reissued, especially in Japan, on Carpenter's box sets every 5 years. So Terry Draper and John Wallaschuk, two members of the band, they co-wrote the tune, and it's an amazing royalty for them, kind of ad infinitum. It'll go until such time as nobody wants Carpenter songs anymore. So it's kind of nice for them. That tune came off an album called 347 EST, and it was a record that kind of went under the radar when it first got released. It did okay here in Canada, which, you know, the band's from Toronto. It was a trio, including Dee Long. And it did okay in 1976, and then that was kind of the end of it. And then in early 1977, a reporter from the Rhode Island Journal in the United States found the record in a pile of stuff that their entertainment division just ignored. They weren't going to review it. And he thought, hey, I'll take this home, take a listen to it. Do you mind if I write a review of the record? And they were like, yeah, knock yourself out. Well, he listened to it, and he thought the album sounded like the Beatles. So he wrote an article that basically said that they were either the Beatles or that it was some variation of members of the Beatles together or some unknown group, and that was kind of lower on the list of things that he said. But everybody read the headline as Beatles release new secret album. And it played well because, in terms of the media, because at that moment, that exact moment in time, the Beatles were in the middle of renegotiating their deal with Capitol Records. They had a deal every 9 years with Capitol, so just before Brian Epstein had died in 1967, he renewed their deal for another 9 years. And then he passed away. And in 1976, that deal came due. So the presumption was that Capitol was going through the vaults and putting out Beatles stuff, but not releasing it under the Beatles name because all these guys still had solo deals with Capitol as well. So the idea was that this Klaatu record was a bunch of outtakes. And that kind of took legs and went, and the media just went mad with it. Meanwhile, the band itself was over in England recording the second record because they were signed to Capitol Records as well, and, you know, they were due a second record. And the first album got kind of repressed into service, and they went to actually warehouses all over the United States and dug up all the deleted stuff sitting on skids and put those back in retail stores until they could repress the album. And they did, and ultimately it sold about 2 million copies. Meanwhile, the band's trying to put a second album out, and they get told in England, by the way, you guys are the Beatles. And they thought that was absolutely hilarious. But the record label in different parts of the world, especially in Australia, they kind of ran with the whole thing and had contests asking people to find clues on the first album. Phone in your clues and tell us what you think on the album is, basically a Beatle clue. And that just spurred sales. And unfortunately, this whole thing kind of blew up on the band because they, as it always goes, everybody thinks it's conspiracy. That Klaatu actually instituted this whole thing, and this was their whole plan for selling records all the time, was claiming that they were the Beatles. Klaatu never said a word. They never said anything about it. And of course, then everyone was like, well, why don't you defend yourselves? Why don't you go out in public and say, hey, we're not trying to tell people that we're the Beatles. And the band just kind of sat back and went, well, wait a minute, it's your rumor. Why do we have to defend ourselves? You made up this nonsense. Why do we have to come out and say, no, it's not true? So they didn't say anything about it. And of course, that just made it worse down the line, because once it was discovered that it was 3 session musicians from Toronto, everybody stopped caring. And when the second album finally did come out, it was because the first album was still selling so well, the band had a chance to actually sit back and take more time on the second record. And it got put out later in the year, right after the Carpenters released Calling Occupants. So the band kind of had a nice little bump in 1977 for sales and stuff. But come the third record in 78, nobody cared. It was kind of like, Klaatu who? Like, weren't you guys the Beatles band? And now you're not. But with that said, a lot of people don't know they actually put out 5 albums.
Yeah, well, they had their 15 minutes, that's for sure. The best part for me is that I've spoken to both Dee Long and Terry Draper, and they're still moving forward with new music. So the experience
for sure
didn't ruin them, so that's pretty cool.
Terry and Dee were both on my label for a while as solo acts, which was kind of nice too. So
right. So let's move on to, let's try Lee Aaron.
Lee, the rock and roll metal queen. Well, Lee's real name is Karen Greening, for those that don't know. And she kind of grew up around Brampton, Ontario, and, playing in high school initially, and then in the rock bars. And it was guys from Moxie and Santers, actually, that got her career off the ground. They helped her out with her first album and appeared as special guests on that album. And that got her some attention that she was able to get signed by Attic Records, which was kind of nice. And through time, she became a force over in Europe. But a lot of people don't know that after that whole thing, once the 90s hit and grunge was a thing, she hooked up with members of Vancouver's Sons of Freedom, and they put out one album under the name Too Precious. And it was a grunge record, literally a Seattle-type Nirvana grunge record that she sang on. And then she changed course once again. She just kind of pivoted 360 degrees and thought, I'm going to do some jazz records. So she's been doing that for quite a while in Vancouver. And here's your trivia. She's married to John Cody, who was one of the late drummers for Bachman Turner Overdrive.
Cool.
They're still married and they have kids, and she's still, she went back to doing her rock thing. Not as a metal queen, but it's straight up rock and roll, which is kind of cool. And she has Sean Kelly playing guitar in the band, and he did a short stint with Helix for a while there, but he was in a great band called Crash Kelly, which was kind of neat.
Yeah, I know 2 or 3 years ago, some friends of mine actually opened for her in London, and that was a pretty fun experience for them. Now, here's somebody else that had a minor association with Lee Aaron, Frank Soda.
Yes, Frank. Well, and when she was doing live originally, like right at the beginning, she needed a backup band. Though the Moxie and the Sanders guys helped her out, it was mostly Frank's backup band, the Imps, that were helping her live until she could hire a real band. But, she needed a record deal before she could actually put together the band that she wanted. And Frank's something else. He's a great performer and great musician all around. I finally met him actually out in Vancouver in 2001. Greg Godovitz from Gatto and I did his book tour. And we hooked up with Frank for lunch one day, and really nice guy. Him and his wife have a duo out in British Columbia that they do all the time. And he keeps coming back, and they were actually Thor's backup band. I don't know if you guys, anybody out there remembers Thor. He had a song called Keep the Dogs Away in 76.
He's got a new project coming too.
Oh yeah, like Thor's never stopped. I mean, he's putting out an album a year easily, and he was a Mr. Universe bodybuilder. That's how he started, and basically he thought, well, I'd love to be able to go out and show my muscles, but, who's going to see this? Short of an actual bodybuilding competition for people to go see, he put a band behind him. So he was never really a singer. He just decided that he wanted some rock and roll behind him so he could stand on stage and bend bars and break things with his teeth.
And blow up water bottles, yeah.
Blow up water bottles. And then ultimately he thought, well, I should put some vocals to this, and that got him a record deal. And, it was quite the image. And, of course, this is the time period of Kiss, too. So everybody was looking for a gimmick. And he had the black leather and the cape and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, there was an association between John Michael or John Michael?
Yeah, John Michael Thorne.
John Michael, yeah. There was an association between him and Kiss as well. I know there was, I think he presented them with, is it a platinum or gold record when they came to Canada? Because Nick Panasico had a hand in that as well.
That's right. Yeah, Nick was promoting Kiss's first shows in Canada. That was kind of his shtick. And Nick, God bless him, I mean, he did the same thing with Rush. He was doing stuff with Symphonic Slam and Rush down in London as well.
There was a lot of people behind the scenes that most of us aren't aware of, and Nick was certainly a big-time behind-the-scenes guy. Now, I met Frank Soda back around, must have been 1977. And this was when he was still with Thor and the Imps.
Right.
And he got me into heavier guitar strings.
Right on.
I showed up to the Saturday afternoon matinee where they always had guys get up and jam. Only this time I didn't have a guitar with me, but my friends weren't having it. They're all in the crowd yelling, "Get Tommy up, get Tommy up."
Right.
So Frank was gracious enough to let me play his BC Rich. I think he had a Mockingbird or a Seagull. Anyway, beautiful guitar. And so I had a real good time jamming with the band. And at the end of it, I said, "Wow, I love this guitar. It sounds great, but man, these strings are heavy." And he explained to me that, the heavier strings gave you better intonation and better tone. And I thought, well, this sure sounds great. So I started going up and up and up with the gauge of my strings.
Right.
And I had this Epiphone electric guitar that had like a Strat style body and a Gibson style headstock. And it wasn't the most solid guitar in the world, but it was all I could afford. And so I got up to this super heavy gauge of strings, artist rope core, and all of a sudden I heard in the neck.
Oh.
So I stopped using such heavy strings. But Frank has always been a sweetheart, and we recently reconnected. He remembered meeting me up in North Bay back in 1977. So that was pretty cool.
That's great. Here's something interesting about the Imps, actually. He had different variations of that band backing them all through the 70s and early 80s. One member was Brian Gagnon from The Hunt. He was the bass player for Frank for a while, and drummer Lawrence Gretsch, who went on to form the Carpet Frogs, which is Burton Cummings' backup band.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. How about Alana Miles?
Alana Miles, well, her real name's Biles, Byles, and she and Much Music VJ Christopher Ward were kind of an item. And he decided he wanted to help get her career off the ground, so he was writing material for her, and they were kind of a team, but they were acting first. That was kind of the thing that they were doing. So they were kind of popping up in skits and stuff on Much Music before Christopher actually got the gig as a VJ on there. And with that, the demos that they wrote and stuff managed to get her a record deal with Atlantic Records. Now, of course, once they got in there, Atlantic kind of went, well, we want to add some other songwriters to this kind of canon and get the things done. But Black Velvet is one of Christopher's hits. So he kind of co-wrote that.
How about, Brave Belt?
Brave Belt. Yeah, that was Randy's first band project after the Guess Who. When he left or quit or got fired from the Guess Who, depending on whose story you listen to, he tried his hand at a solo thing, but it just wasn't taking off. He didn't have the songs behind him. He wanted to do some guitar work, so he put out an album called Axe, which is basically just a bunch of guitar workouts. But he teamed up again with Chad Allen, who was one of the original vocalists prior to Burton Cummings and the Guess Who. And they decided to do kind of this sleepy country rock thing called Brave Belt. And Robin Bachman was the drummer, so it was a trio. And they put out the first album, which had Done Robin's Gone on it. And as they kind of worked their way into getting the second album together, they wanted to get a little heavier, a little beefier. And Chad wasn't comfortable with that, but he kind of played along, and they brought in Fred Turner. So Fred Turner became the bass player. Now they were a four-piece. But when they went to the point where they were going to record the second record, which was Brave Belt 2, it was just a lot heavier than Chad could deal with. So he bowed out. So once again, they were a trio, but now it was, Robin Bachman on drums plus Randy and Fred Turner. And the second album didn't do as well. So the guys are like, well, our style's changing anyways, and the writing's getting a little heavier and everything. Let's shop a third record, but, Reprise Records isn't going to pick us up for a third option, so let's do that. So Mercury Records was interested in the United States, and like, we really love the new stuff, guys, but that name Brave Belt, it's kind of got an odor to it now because the first two albums flopped. So why don't you try a new name? So they went with Bachman Turner Overdrive. So the very first BTO album is actually Brave Belt 3. It's actually the third Brave Belt album.
Cool.
And the rest is history.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Here's one that not a lot of people remember, but I do. Star Child.
Star Child, I'm going to tell you right now, don't know much about them. I actually found an audio tape of their album that they recorded for Axe Records, and it took me a while to actually track down any of the members to give the thing back to them. But I was completely unaware of this band. I had no idea. And I'm going to cop to ignorance on this. I've since put them in the encyclopedia, but I don't really have much background on them.
Well, that's cool. They were. I think they had a good run in the bars for a while, and But that was just more or less a test on your deep dive, I guess. But you're doing really well so far. Here's another one. I'm going to take a chance on Wireless.
Wireless. Oh. Well, those boys were actually, the original band was actually from Australia, and they put out one album on Atlantic Records and then came to Canada to tour and liked it here so much that they stayed. But a couple of the members got homesick and actually returned to Australia, so they needed a rhythm section. So Marty Moran, who was the original drummer for Gatto, left Gatto to join Wireless. So he became the new drummer for Wireless. And they ended up recording 2 more albums, more Canadian-oriented, for Anthem Records. And those albums are in quite demand, actually, because, it was album-oriented rock at that time. And there wasn't a lot of that going around in Canada, not at the point where they were doing it. It became a bigger thing later in Canada with bands like Honeymoon Suite and Brighton Rock and stuff. But at that time, late 70s, they were kind of unique. And it may be part of their curse, is that they were ahead of the curve. They were too soon for Canadian taste.
I know they did have one marginally successful hit with a cover of Go Now. The Moody Blues song, Go Now?
That's right, yeah. Denny Lane wrote that from Wings.
Right,
yeah.
Okay, how about, what do you know about Coney Hatch?
Coney Hatch. Carl Dixon and Andy Curran, those boys, same thing. Anthem Records kind of grabbed them because they were a bar band playing around Toronto. And Carl, I'm not sure everybody knows this or not, in the 90s ended up being the new voice for the Guess Who. After Coney Hatch only lasted 3 albums and a greatest hits, I think. And following that, Andy went solo. He had a band called Soho 69. And then Carl went on to do this thing with the Guess Who. And unfortunately, he was in a really bad, back to Australia again, he was in a really bad car accident in Australia while touring. And almost cost him his life, but he recovered really well. My wife and I saw him in Oakville, 2-3 summers ago? Yeah, I think a couple of summers back. And he does a whole set of Guess Who songs. He sounds so much like Burton Cummings. It's crazy.
Yeah, really. When you think about their was it Monkey Bars, their big hit?
Monkey Bars was, that was an Andy song.
Right. Now, who was the guitar player that played on that?
Steve Shelsky, who ended up being a member of Gatto for a little while there. In 2005, he replaced Gino Scarpelli.
I know there's a lot of guitar players at the time that were kind of strangling themselves trying to figure out that hellacious guitar solo in the song Monkey Bars.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's very interesting. How about April Wine? What do you know about that band?
April Wine. Well, I mean, it's a long history because it was the Henman brothers and Miles Goodwin that kind of put the band together. And over time, the Henmans ended up leaving. So it was kind of Miles's band, and he replaced people as they went along. What a lot of people don't know about April Wine, they wrote a lot of original material. Miles is a hell of a songwriter, and I'll credit to him for that. But some of their biggest hits were all cover tunes. Bad Side of the Moon was a cover tune. Should Have Been a Lady was a cover tune, and so was Sign of the Gypsy Queen. And those tunes were brought to the table by producer Ralph Murphy. In the 70s, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't know, because CanCon was a new invention, it was the requirement by the Canadian government that records had to have a certain amount of Canadian in it to get airplay on the radio. And radio stations were pushed to have at least 30% Canadian content to qualify, just for exposure for Canadians all around, and help with, people in the Canadian production business and musicians, etc., songwriters, and you name it. It kind of helped, stir the industry here in Canada and build an infrastructure for us. So the race was on from 1971 when CanCon was introduced. Everybody needed Canadian songs to get on the radio. But, there was a shortage of people actually writing great songs. So the idea was the song pluggers would go around and basically sub-license songs for the territory of Canada, have Canadian artists record them, and they'd basically qualify as half CanCon. That would get them on the radio. So Ralph Murphy, who had produced April Wine, he ran around and got the rights to Bad Side of the Moon, Should Have Been a Lady.
Editor's note, Jaimie really knows his stuff, and what he meant to say just there was, could have been a lady. Now back to the show.
And had the band record those two tunes. And of course, the band doesn't want to. They're like, no, we write our own songs. It's great. It's like, just do a cover tune. It'll get you some airplay. The album will sell, yada, yada, yada. You can carry on and tour and make money that way. So this was kind of a frequent thing, and April Wine really benefited from that. Sign of the Gypsy Queen came a bit later than that. That was a tune by Lawrence Hudd. He was a French-Canadian, and they really liked the tune. And Miles negotiated with him because he changed some of the lyrics and got a co-credit on that song, which was kind of nice that Lawrence was able to, get that song out there and kind of share the songwriting credit so everybody wins. Celine Dion does the same thing. She's like, I will sing your song. You give me half songwriting credit. It's an old Elvis Presley trick. Colonel Tom Parker had Elvis's name on every single song, and Elvis never wrote a tune in his entire career. So, and this is what's, kind of inside baseball that a lot of people don't know, is that somebody that sings someone else's tune, usually there's a deal in it where the singer would get a little piece of the action as well, because otherwise, what's the point? If they didn't write the tune, they're not going to make much money off of it. Yeah. So. Yeah. Now, as an insider, I'm sure that you know about my personal connection to April Wine. Yes. I had David Henman play on my cover of Drop Your Guns a couple of years ago. Yeah, David's an old friend of mine. Him and I played on one of Terry Draper's solo records, light years later, I should say. Oh, really? I didn't know about that. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Mr. Rock and Roll Encyclopedia, you. Well, I play bass and guitar, so I've kind of done some session work as well. So nice. Okay, now here's two bands that are connected intrinsically: Chilliwack and the Headpins. Yeah, Brian Too Loud McLeod, the guitar player, was in both. He was in kind of the last famous version of Chilliwack, and he kind of had Headpins going at the same time, but the Headpins ended up taking priority. So he had Headpins kind of on the back burner the whole time he was in Chilliwack until they finally got their deal and took off, and then it became a priority because he had to tour that act as well. Yeah. With Darby Mills. And Darby's story is quite interesting as well. She was in a version of the band right up until recently, and then she decided to finally go solo, and hats off to her. I mean, she's been kind of carving her own path with her solo stuff, and it's really, really good. Yeah, she has. There's an interesting short documentary on her. It's on her website, on the I've seen that. Darby Mills Project website. Yeah, and she went over to Europe after she had first left the Headpins.
she went over to Europe, and I think it was Pete Townshend's studio that she was recording at. She had signed her own deal after the Headpins. I can't remember the label, but anyway, she went over to Europe and she recorded with all these absolutely wonderful session players, and she came back with the tapes, and the A&R guy that had signed her had been let go.
Of course.
And the new guy
Didn't
like it because
Yep.
he wanted to push, are you ready? Tiffany. And that was the rest of the story. Yeah.
Yes. That's actually quite a popular story with a lot of artists. Most of what's happened in the Canadian music industry, especially in the 80s, was that the shuffling of A&R men caused the collapse or the career destruction of a lot of artists in Canada. There's a band here called Refugee, same thing. They were signed and had an album, and then the label decided that they weren't going to push, anymore because the A&R guy moved on, and the new guy that came in was like, well, it wasn't my signing. Why should I care? It was all about egos and all about, commissions at the back end kind of thing, and it had nothing to do with rock and roll.
Yeah, that's right. I've talked about the Suits a lot. They put a damper on my career in a few instances because I couldn't. To me, it's always been about the music, and maybe I just didn't meet the right guys in Suits. I don't know, but
right.
Anyway.
Well, we were talking actually online, and this is kind of interesting, I think, for your listeners, is that somebody posted a picture of there was a band out of Toronto called the Jitters in the 80s, and they had a hit called Last of the Red Hot Fools. And when they went to do the photo shoot for the album cover, the A&R guy said, well, 4-piece bands just aren't in anymore. We need it to be a 5-piece band. So one of the members of the band brought his brother in, and he's actually on the album cover pretending to be a member of the band because some suit decided that a 5-piece was more visually impressive than the actual band itself. It's this kind of nonsense. It's what happened with Teenage Head in the United States. Oh, well, Teenage Head is offensive, so we're going to put an S at the end and call it Teenage Heads. Like, anyone's going to know or not know that that's what you've done? That you've tried to graffiti over the band's name by putting a letter S at the end? Like, everybody knew. You just look like idiots for doing that. There was another story about the Spoons, and their big breakout album was Arias and Symphonies with that had the hit Nova Heart on it. And when A&M Records went to put it out in the States, the A&R guys are like, well, we have to change the album title. And they're like, why? And they said, well, because Americans don't know what the word Arias means. It's like, are you kidding? Well, they were all confused, too, because the picture on if anybody can imagine it, the picture on the cover of Arias and Symphonies is literally it's a Royal Cavalry on the front cover. So it's all these people dressed up in suits on horses, basically doing dressage in the middle of a cabaret hall. So, of course, it looks all very highfalutin and very classic music-oriented. But at that time, it was pretty standard for synth pop bands. I mean, if you look at any of the British stuff released at the time, all their album covers are the same. It's all kind of royal-looking, and the fonts are all, specialized italics and things like that. And the Spoons were just playing along with that whole thing, and the Americans didn't get it. They were like, can you change the name of the album? The band never did, though. They held fast. With that said, the record didn't sell in the States at all. So,
right. Well, let's do a couple more before we get into what you're currently up to. Okay, how about Hellfield?
Hellfield. Well, Mitchell Field, who cleverly contracted his name to Hellfield, he put the band together in the 70s, and they got signed to CBS Records and had a really cool hit with a song called Tell Me All You're Listening. And they went through a lot of band member changes. The late Rick Lamb was playing keyboards for them, and they had Jamie Larson was in the band as well. Jamie's out west. He's been in a band called the Mustangs for years. And then Hellfield didn't last for very long. They did one kind of last recording at the Gasworks, and it's an album that I believe Mitch is now thinking about issuing properly, finally putting this final gig out so that fans can hear it. And they were talking about a new record and doing a tour last year, and then the lockdown happened.
Right. Well, I spoke to Mitch recently, and he tells me that they're using technology to continue work on that project.
Oh, good. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mitch was in the big. He had lived in California for most of the late 80s and early 90s, and he was in that great big earthquake in 1989, the one that took out the highway. And he was telling me the story about being in an apartment building, and he was living on the 6th floor, and the building collapsed, and him and his dog got into the big iron bathtub that he had, and the whole thing collapsed, and he had to spend the night in his car.
Wow.
And in fact, a couple of days, I think he ended up spending in his car because that earthquake was something else. It killed a lot of people.
That stopped the World Series, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it did. Yeah. But he survived. He survived this building collapsing on him, which is kind of incredible. And we're glad he's still here.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know, like Mitch was the lead vocalist for the band, but he's traditionally a drummer. He spent his time in bands drumming. And he was in a band with Denton Young from Zahn for many years. And then
really?
Denton went on to form Zahn, and Mitch went on to form Hellfield. So there was kind of a 2-for-1. And ironically, they ended up on the same record label, CBS.
Wow. I have a Zahn story for you, and you might already be aware of this, but I was present at an Alice Cooper concert at the C&E Grandstand.
I was there as well.
And Zahn was the opening band. And tell everybody what happened.
Well, Alice decided that he wasn't going to show up. I mean, there's rumors for years and years and years about why he didn't show up. They thought he was wasted and couldn't make it to the stage. Turns out he had a really horrific asthma attack. And the reason he lives in Arizona is because it's dry air there, and he prefers that. He's an old Detroit boy, but he's got really bad asthma, and he had a bad attack that night and couldn't make it. Now, it didn't help that nobody came out and explained that fact to the audience. They just came out and told Zahn, who are the opening act, hey, could you keep playing a little longer so that we can figure out what to do about Alice? And ultimately, people started getting restless, and Denton was left announcing to the audience that Alice Cooper wasn't going to be there, and they went nuts. The audience started throwing chairs. They had to bring in horses, police horses, to kind of calm the people at the C&E Grandstand down. I was working that night at the grandstand. I actually was a janitor there, so I got to see the whole thing firsthand. But I was in a band at the time, and our lead singer recorded the whole thing. So he's actually got that announcement of Denton saying, hey, Alice isn't going to be here tonight, and people going mental. We actually wrote a song about it and released that with the little clip of Denton saying that Alice Cooper wasn't going to be there.
Yeah, so like I say, I was there as well, and it was just horrific.
Madness.
Man, I was right down. We had moved. We had tickets, I think, in the bleachers, and we had moved up towards the front of the stage. And I could see when they started taking guitars off the stands and so on, I said to my buddy, something's wrong. Remember, that was a really long interval between Zahn and the announcement. I mean, it was really long. I said, this is like crazy. And I tried to tell my friends there's something wrong.
Yep.
Oh, no, we're going to see Alice Cooper. Yeah. I started to make my way to the door. And by the time I got to the bleachers, it was like thunder. And I couldn't believe how many police there were in the city of Toronto.
Well, I think that's the issue, too, is that the reason there was a long delay is that they wanted to call the troops in. Right. Because if the listeners remember this, 1980 was the summer of the riots. Gatto played early June at Ontario Place, and there was an issue with access to the gates at that one, and there was a small riot there, to the point where they flipped over a TTC streetcar on the C&E grounds. They actually tipped it over. That barely made the news, but it was 2 weeks later when the Teenage Head riot happened. And that was basically, word had gotten out that because they were having rock and roll shows at Ontario Place for free, this was the place to go. So, of course, 25,000 people showed up at Ontario Place, and the capacity was only 18,000. So they sealed the gates, which was a stupid thing to do. They should have just let the people sit on the lawns. And instead, they tried to keep them out, and that was the second riot. Well, and then Alice Cooper happened in August. And that was kind of the end of it for concerts there. Like, Ontario Place canceled their whole rock program for years after that.
You've just mentioned Gatto. Let's do one more. Flood.
Oh, great band. The Pilling Brothers, who, and this is what a lot of people don't know, the Pilling Brothers are from Birmingham, England, and they were actually musicians that backed up Cat Stevens in the 1960s when Stevens was a pop idol. Long before Peace Train and, Moonshadow and all that stuff, Cat Stevens was actually the David Cassidy of his time. He was cute, long-haired guy who was out singing his little pop tunes, and the Pilling Brothers backed him up. And then their family moved to Canada, and of course, they were enrolled in high school in Toronto here, and they met Greg Godovitz, and he became the bass player for them, and some other local guys that they were playing musicians, all very enthusiastic, and they formed Flood. This was early 70s. And from there, they managed to get themselves a record deal, several. They were on Warner Brothers initially for their first album, and they went to record their second album, and they were sent to England to stay at Richard Branson of Virgin Records. He had a castle, and there was a recording studio in the castle, so the band was sent there. But they spent so much time partying, they almost got nothing done. Greg has told me that there are session tapes, but the stuff's not finished. So it's never been released. It sits in a Warner Brothers vault. And it was there that Greg met Mike Oldfield of Tubular Bells fame. He was there at the same time. He was the first guy signed to Virgin Records by Richard Branson. And he was writing Tubular Bells while Flood was there recording their second record. And, we know what happened with Tubular Bells. It became the soundtrack to The Exorcist, and Flood came back to Canada without an album.
Now, having said that, I'm sure you know this next bit about Tubular Bells. That almost didn't happen.
You're right. Because Greg decided that one night while they were in the common area where the fireplace was, Greg decided that he wanted to light a fire, and he grabbed a bunch of scrap paper off of a table and went to light the thing, and it turns out it was part of the manuscript for Tubular Bells. Oldfield had a fit. Don't you dare.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. So before we go, let's just tell the people, Jaimie, what are you up to these days? What have you got going on?
Right now I'm updating the Canadian Pop Music Encyclopedia. We normally I reprint the book annually. Last year I decided to just let it sit so I could do a massive revision. And it's going to see the light of day in July, both as a revised website, which is canpopencyclopedia.ca, and then the books themselves will come out, and there's a lot. It's about 500 pages per book, and it's basically just a breakdown of, alphabetically, it's a summation of the careers of different artists that have had a history in Canada of releasing music. And what I'm trying to do is update it to the point where it's got a lot of new material in it. I've been basically focusing on the vinyl era of Canadian music up until now. But because there's been another 20 years of history that's come since that, there's a lot of artists missing that have become huge and famous in their own right. So I'm adding those to the whole thing. Meanwhile, I'm in a band called Mr. Moray, and we're in the middle of our second full-length album. And we got clipped by the lockdown. We had just finished recording and rough mixing 7 songs when we got shut out. So we haven't been back to record the next 7 songs. And we tried to rehearse in the summertime, and we did. So we've got basically we've kind of wood shopped the 7 new tunes. But we're really anxious to get back into the studio and finish this album up.
And we're all anxious to hear it. What's happening with Bullseye Records?
Well, I mean, at this point, it's just kind of a vanity project to me, but I've been helping out. This is kind of my giving back thing. I have a full-time job now, and I don't need the record label to kind of make a living. So I just use it as an imprint to help artists that haven't got the means to get their stuff up on Spotify, to put it on Bandcamp, to get it out to Amazon and iTunes and all that kind of thing. And we've just released, as of Friday, the 8th album by Arapacis, which is a heavy metal band in Eastern Ontario featuring Jerry Fielden and his wife, Michelle McPherson. And they've gotten David Stone to play keyboards. Now, Stone was a member of Rainbow, and he also played with Deep Purple and Symphonic Slam. So Stone actually co-writes on this and appears on it. So it's kind of a neat thing to have for a brand new record coming out. And they're on our Bullseye Canada Bandcamp page. The new record is there, and it's called Water Dog.
Very cool. We'll look forward to hearing that too. Well, Jaimie, this has been great. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to eventually a time where we can sit down and have a coffee face to face. And
yeah, one day I got to get back out to London. I haven't been there since. I'll mention this because it's got a London connection. Is that I co-authored the Skip Prokop's book called Sunny Days, and that came out again right when the lockdown happened. So I wasn't able to get out there to promote it. But when the coast is clear, I want to get back down to London because that's kind of where Skip, rest his soul, spent his last days, was in London. He was a very huge supporter of London music. And, of course, 50 years of playing with Lighthouse. So
yeah, and that reminds me, I'm going to have to talk to some of the people at the Forest City London Music Awards Hall of Fame because he should be in that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a Greg Simpson, also an old friend of mine, was part of that committee that was supposed to vote him in. And in fact, that was the last thing we talked about before, unfortunately, Greg passed away last year too. So
yeah, that was about 2 weeks after we spoke on this show.
That's correct.
And his last live gig, actually, Greg's last live gig, was as MC for my last Rockin' for Kids for the Children's Health Foundation show. We had 7 acts, and it was on Greg to make sure that everybody was on time and to do all that. And he just did a fabulous job, and it was just so sad to see him go.
Yeah, I miss him a lot.
Yeah. Well, on a brighter note, we now have vaccines, and it's looking like the majority of us who want to be vaccinated will be good to go by the end of the summer. So we're going to have live music. We're going to have these projects back together.
For sure.
I'm looking forward to it. And, thanks once again, Jaimie. This has been great. And
you're welcome. It was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And until next time.
And I learned something, too. You told me some things I didn't know about Darby Mills. So.
Well, there you go. But you still win. You are the king of the rock and roll trivia.
Honestly, Greg Simpson actually knew more than me, and that's the biggest loss, I think, for him not being around, is that he could kind of he was the king of trivia in London too. If anybody knows him.
Oh, everybody knows him here.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Jaimie, thanks a lot, and until next time, cheers.
All right, thanks, Tommy.
Well, that was a fun little walk down memory lane. In fact, it was so fun for Jaimie and I both that we've decided we're going to do this again on a regular basis. So stay tuned for more rock and roll trivia to come down the road from Jaimie Vernon. Meanwhile, here is Happy Ever Over by Mr. Moray, Jaimie's current band. Enjoy.
Well, there you go. It's what you want.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including producing, editing, guest acquisition, etc. All rights reserved. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends was written and recorded by Tommy Solo with a little help from my friends in the Night Crew. And hey, if you like the show, why not subscribe? Until next time, cheers.